Mr. Hempt, are you recording already? No, you were supposed to wait. No, never mind. Never mind. In the present web of global political relations, America seems to be at the forefront of many a conflict. This has been a source of great debate in the United States. Some seem to believe that America cannot afford to be the policeman of the world, while others believe that it is our duty to spread the ideals of democracy and freedom. Yet, it wasn't always like this. For the first century and a half of its existence, the United States had always attempted, though sometimes unsuccessfully, to be isolationist. Yet, with our involvement in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, particularly the Cold War, and post 9/11 conflicts, we have seemingly abandoned this mindset. Today, we will dive into one of the most controversial instances in which the United States decided to intervene in foreign affairs. Soon, we will meet Dr. Lawyer, a man whose very name is every parent's dream and has devoted his life to studying and teaching about the Cold War, the Vietnam era of the Cold War, at the University of Rye. Welcome to this episode of 600 Seconds. We'll be right back in a moment. I love these chairs. We are about to meet Dr. Lawyer. He requested that we meet in the woods. He did not provide a reason. Perhaps he thought it would be aesthetically pleasing. Just a thing of mystery. Pan the camera.
Oh, sorry.
No, to Dr. Lawyer.
Sorry.
It's great to be here with you today.
Great to meet you, sir. Okay, shall we?
Yeah.
No. Mr. Hempt, why are you sit? The chair, if you would please.
Yes, sir.
No, I want you to put it over there.
Oh, okay.
Not actually, dingus.
Sorry.
Man, that guy, I don't know how you can
I apologize on his behalf.
No, it's fine.
No, it's not. He's incompetent, but cheap. That's the only reason he has a job. So could you get us started with setting the stage in America for what led up to the Vietnam era of the Cold War?
Yeah, so speaking about the U.S. domestically, we actually regressed to the gender norms of the 1800s, i.e. the cult of domesticity and the rampant consumerism of the roaring 20s. There were several civil rights movements that began to rise in popularity, including the second wave of feminism and also civil rights movements led by individuals such as Malcolm X that fought for civil rights for African Americans. There were two later movements that fought for African American rights, such as those led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and these would also influence the American perception of the Vietnam War once it began.
See, and what was going on in foreign affairs?
That's kind of a broad question, but before getting into the nitty and gritty details of Vietnam, it is important to note that during that time, generally in Europe, countries were dealing with the repercussions of the Second World War. And specifically, the Soviet Union was really trying to exert their influence throughout Europe, as seen in the creation of the Berlin Wall around the city of East Berlin.
I see. But this was also a symbolic structure, correct?
Yes, it is fallacious to think of it solely as being a physical wall. It was a physical wall, but that dreaded barbed wire laden wall also represented Soviet efforts to oppress the people of East Berlin, and as part of the greater global conflict between communism and democracy, it represented the harm that innocent citizens endured as part of that conflict.
I see. So this would usually be seen as an act of war. Why wasn't it seen as such?
That depends. It was dependent on the Kremlin's response. They actually said that instead of trying to keep people in, the wall was meant to keep fascists out of East Berlin from undermining the state. So that was actually the plan that they went with. And with that plan, the wall was able to stand for more than 2 decades, too short of 3 decades.
See, that's less than half my life.
Dang!
Did you just Kevin Hart Don Cheadle me?
After Dr. Lawyer regained his composure, we continued our discussion.
So, beginning in the mid to late 1900s, it was a very contradictory time. You know, we saw several instances of obviously the conflict between the U.S. and Soviet Union, where they tried to exert influence over the other. Although there were also many examples, or at least several examples, maybe make it be too much, of the two sides working together to assuage that competition.
Would you be able to provide an example?
Take the Test Ban Treaty the Limited Test Ban Treaty, I apologize, of 1963, signed between the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the U.S. It prohibited the testing of nuclear arms in areas that were considered to be underwater, in the atmosphere, and in space. So although it is called the Limited Test Ban Treaty, that is a misnomer because essentially nuclear testing was banned everywhere between those two countries. And I just find the signing of this to be particularly interesting because much of the Cold War was centered around that nuclear arms race. So just that progression from being in that arms race to taking the steps to limit the nuclear arms with which both sides were testing is particularly interesting. And we also saw that cooperation with the establishment of the White House Kremlin hotline, by which Soviet and U.S. Officials could quickly interact with one another as to dispel any misunderstandings. But we'll get to that later on. Yeah. Because before we get into Vietnam, it's really important to talk about the French Indochina War. The area that would become Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos was previously occupied by France. And at a certain point, the citizens living in that area became very frustrated with the limitations that living in France placed upon their, not living in France, living under French occupation placed upon their lives. So eventually, after rebelling and defeating the French, something came to be known as the Geneva Conference. And that was a period between, it was a meeting between obviously France, the citizens in that area, and other countries such as the United States, Soviet Union. And it was decided that Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam would be created. And specifically in Vietnam, the country would be divided along the 17th parallel into a northern communist section and a southern pro-democratic section. The northern section was supported by the Soviet Union, and the southern section was supported by the U.S. And as the time came closer to that reunification election, which would set in place one government in Vietnam, it became more apparent to everyone, including the United States, that the leader of the southern side was inept and corrupt, and he actually canceled the reunification election before it occurred, which was a good thing because he would have certainly lost that election.
Wow. Cut. Cut!
Oh. Sorry, sir.
However, at a certain point, the United States decided that Diem was too much of a liability, thereby approving a coup d'etat against him, which culminated in his assassination. But we'll get back to that in a moment.
You know, back home, JFK had been elected president, and he was dealing with some things. You know, we chose to go to the moon and do the other things. You just love that school, don't you?
Oh yeah, I couldn't live without it.
Man, you're crazy. You know, since the Soviets had Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite, Americans, all of them, had the moon on their mind.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Kennedy's promises may not have been fulfilled in his lifetime, but they did come true in 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But there were more threatening things happening in this time than the space race.
So, partially in response to the U.S.'s stationing of missiles toward the Soviet Union in Turkey, the Soviet Union placed some of their missiles and aimed them towards they placed some of their missiles in Cuba, that is, and aimed them towards the United States in an event that would be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is crucial to note that at this time, Fidel Castro was the president of Cuba, and with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, although he was able to keep his power, he wanted to bolster that security and saw that the keeping of Soviet missiles in Cuba was a possible way for him to do so. In the United States, this created a very frantic situation, and it was one of 2 times in which the United States reached DEFCON level 2. Moreover, in a presidential address, John F. Kennedy, in a presidential address that was professed to be of the highest national urgency, President John F. Kennedy, he did talk about the imminent threat of U.S. and Soviet direct conflict, although he also reassured the nation of its resiliency and continued efforts to secure peace and freedom globally, including in the United States. However dire the situation became, it ultimately culminated with Soviet and U.S. leaders agreeing to remove their respective missiles in Turkey and in Cuba, and there was also the establishment of a White House Kremlin hotline in which U.S. and Soviet leaders could speak with one another as to dispel any misunderstandings such as the Cuban Missile Crisis from occurring in the future. However, with his soon to be coming assassination, John F. Kennedy was not able to use his hotline for long.
Yes, his story, sadly, would come to a premature and now heavily scrutinized end in 1963. We were able to get a brief sit-down with Agent Cairo Roptern of the CIA concerning this matter. The producers have requested that I let the audience know that despite their uncanny resemblance, Agent Roptern and our bungling cameraman, Mr. Hempt, are not in any way related.
Yes, of course, Mr. Hempt. We're the ones that invited him. Let him in. How's that even a question?
Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Let's make this quick, okay?
All right, let's get straight into it. What was the statement, or the official statement, released on JFK's assassination?
Well, you're making it sound like the official statement and what actually happened weren't the same, but in reality, they're identical. Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy, and that's all there is to it.
Okay, I understand that, but
There are no buts.
I'm gonna do a but. At the time of the assassination, Mr. Oswald was positioned behind the Kennedys, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so doesn't it then defy logic that when he was shot from behind, Kennedy's had moved backwards? Okay, because I'm not saying that it's one way or another. I'm just wondering if it's possible that there's some more to this.
Unfortunately, that's classified, sir.
Okay, do you think the CIA may be covering something up?
Again, that's classified information. I can't disclose that.
Okay. Was Mr. Oswald really solely responsible for the assassination?
All right, this interview's over.
Okay.
Sit back down. Turn off the cameras.
We are back with... Wake up, Mr. Hempt. You are blocking the camera.
Sorry, boss. Whoops.
We built all the way up to this. Now let's talk about it. How did the Vietnam War start?
Yeah, so like you said, we already talked about the political tensions that built up to the war, but we're going to see the actual fighting begin with the Tonkin Gulf incident in Vietnam. That was the first conflict in which North Vietnamese soldiers and U.S. soldiers physically fought. And we're also, unlike other wars, we're not going to see Congress give a direct and official declaration of war, but rather they're going to give then President Johnson broad powers that officially, unofficially allow him to declare war against Vietnam.
I see, but this was not a no wars were popular. This was not a war supported by the American people, now was it?
No, that's actually spot on. Vietnam, well, the Vietnam War would turn out to be one of America's most controversial wars. You know, there are many individuals in America's, in civil rights movements, and that even included celebrities like Muhammad Ali. These individuals believed that there was a discrepancy in them being sent to Vietnam to fight for civil rights when they did not receive those same rights at home. They believed that at that time, instead of focusing their efforts on Vietnam, the U.S. should have focused their efforts on securing those rights at home for them. So in that sense, a lot of individuals did not believe that it was fair.
Yeah, it was like a war of paradox. Sadly, we can't get into each battle in this episode. How did the war come to a close?
Yeah, so with that, you have to remember that now we're in Nixon's presidency, right? And as Nixon's strategy for getting out, it was something known as Vietnamization. Basically, as part of that process, U.S. soldiers would gradually leave Vietnam as the responsibility, or at least from the U.S., would leave the soldiers and go towards the southern Vietnamese soldiers. And that was how it turned out at first. And although Nixon was he was a very popular president during his first term, and even during his second term, he was supported by the silent majority. Although there was an instance with the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, that was a government set of documents in which it was shown to the American people how Nixon and his administration and other government officials did not tell the truth about the U.S. actually leaving Vietnam as they said they would as part of Vietnamization. But that did not have a very great effect on his downfall. The ultimate event that would lead to Nixon's downfall was his covering up of the burglary at the Watergate Hotel, in which members of Nixon's administration and his re-election team burglarized the DNC's office at Watergate, trying to document Nixon's ultimate complication in the effort, although he did not initially start it, would lead to the further release of incriminating information. And as his impeachment began in the House, he resigned, becoming the first U.S. president to do so. The first and only U.S. president to do so at this time.
Yes. So, with all of this going on, with all this happening, Vietnam and then Nixon, what did America look like after this?
Yeah, so this is a very multifaceted question. It was divided. We had liberal movements such as the New Left and hippie movements going against some of the government's more conservative actions. Although we also had, on the flip side, conservative movements, individuals, and some of which were in the silent majority, coming and contributing to the conservative backlash and trying to restore some of those conservative values to America, at least in their eyes. But Vietnam, there would be a stain in the country. There would be a very grave distrust among citizens toward the government, and whether the government was telling the truth. And that's something we saw then, and that's something we see today, and also the mass casualties of Vietnamese and U.S. associated with the Vietnam War raised the question of why we went to war and what was really the result of it.
I see. Well, Ms. Dr. Lawyer, I very much appreciate your coming on. Mr. Hempt. As I was saying, I very much want to thank you for taking the time to come on 600 Seconds. We very much appreciate it.
I have always loved coming on your program, and I hope you'll invite me back in the future.
Of course. Thank you very much. The legacy of the Vietnam War is now one of shame. Regardless of what good they may have accomplished in their times, anyone associated with prolonging this unjust and frankly illogical war has had their own legacies diminished. Today, the Middle East is in a state of great turmoil. Pretending as though our intervention over there can't affect things over here is foolish. The way our leaders elect to handle this crisis will be a major talking point in our own domestic politics. And just like in Vietnam, anyone associated with prolonging this conflict will have their legacies diminished. Now, it is imperative to make certain that there is absolutely no place for anti-Semitism. At the same time, it is just as important to recognize the fact that it is un-American to support genocide, even when under the guise of anti-terrorist actions and dictatorship. The truth is, dictatorship looms over America right now. And if our present leaders do not get their act together, wannabe dictators will replace them. On that happy note, this has been 600 Seconds. Well, it's more like 1,000 seconds, but who's counting? Thank you for tuning in.